At issue this week, Ottawa's use of the Emergencies Act, an unprecedented response to shut down the convoy protests in the nation's capital and elsewhere. But now a federal judge says the government's use of the act was unreasonable and infringed on protesters' charter rights.
The use of emergency powers are important in a national emergency, but they're dangerous, and they take away accountability and protection for ordinary people.
Speaking to CBC Radio's The House, the former Minister of Justice disagrees with the court's decision.
This was an occupation. It wasn't a protest. Characterizing this merely as protest is missing the very damaging impact that these occupations had on other Canadians and their fundamental rights, their charter rights.
The federal government says it will appeal this decision, but what does it tell us about the limitations of the Emergency Act? Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton, here to break it down this week. Chantal Hebert, Coyne and Althia Raj. Good to see everyone again. Chantal, I'll maybe start with you on this one. Did this come as a surprise to you that a federal court judge found different things than what Justice Rouleau found at the commission?
Not necessarily. Justice Rouleau himself, when he reached this conclusion that the threshold for using the act had been met, had mentioned that he felt that he was on an infrastructure of facts that was maybe fragile. And interestingly, the federal court justice also pointed out how fragile his own infrastructure was. It was a really different decision to read from many of the decisions I've read over the years, in the sense that at some point, Justice Mosley says, if I'd been sitting at the cabinet table at that point, I probably or possibly would have gone the way that the federal government went, but my job is to read the law, and I feel it was unreasonable. So I thought it was interesting too, people from the law coming to different conclusions. Yeah. Basically means that it's not easy to find the sweet spot where you can use the emergency law, and I think that's good.
Yeah, and how much do you think that reflects, Andrew, on the fact that it was created back in 1988, if my memory serves me, and it hadn't been used before? So they were testing out a lot of what was there.
Absolutely. It was the first time the law had been invoked and the first time anybody's ruled on it in a court of law. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty until this is finally resolved at the Supreme Court level. I see a lot of people jumping up and down and being very excited at this court ruling. Among them people who would normally be crying about the courts as agents of the deep state or unelected judges running roughshod over the will of Parliament, but just give them a ruling they like, and it's centuries of English law, and they get very, very misty-eyed about it. It's a very strange ruling in a lot of ways. The judge at several times says, on a common sense definition of the term national emergency, public order emergency, the government would probably be on safe grounds, but on the very narrow and technical grounds of the CSIS Act, which was imported into the Emergencies Act, it doesn't pass muster on that. Well, no kidding, because CSIS has powers and does things that go way beyond anything contemplated under the Emergencies Act. So yeah, there's going to be a very high bar. So I think it is worth revisiting whether in fact it was proper or reasonable to use the CSIS definition, and it's still unclear to me whether the judge was right in his application of it. But look, the test on this is not correctness. The test is reasonableness. Was the government reasonable to make the call it made, given the information it had at the time? That's where the judge's finding is sort of at odds with that statement that Chantal referred to towards the end of his ruling, where he says, I probably would have done what the government did, and the only reason I'm differing with them now is in hindsight with information I have now. Yeah. I suspect that's going to come up at appeal.
Yeah, I would imagine the government might agree if they had the same amount of hindsight as well. Althia, do you think that this will lead to changes in the legislation?
A few things. I'm not sure that my reading of the judgment is the same as Andrew's. I think Justice Mosley basically is begging, that's how it reads, the federal government to amend the law, because he says, as Andrew points out, that the threat for the security of Canada, that is defined by the CSIS Act, and if it wasn't, then he would not have found that the government erred in applying the law. And so he's basically begging the Liberal government to introduce changes to this law on several fronts, but that being the primary one. And it is interesting because I suspect the Conservatives are going to say, you know, this is outrageous, the government is acting like a totalitarian state and they're just trying to weaken the law so they can apply it more broadly. And so instead of having a conversation about do we have the legislation we need to have to respond to the threats that we're facing and that we're going to face in the future, we may not have that unless the NDP and the Bloc Québécois is willing to kind of give a little bit of their political capital to the government to fix this problem. With regards to what's actually in the judgment, I thought it was pretty balanced. It's been phrased as a way of like a real defeat against the government, but that's not my reading of it. And I wonder if on some of the several points where Justice Mosley actually finds that the government acted appropriately, that at the Court of Appeal they might actually, you know, they might not get the decision that they want. Right. That being said, I don't think they have a choice. Politically, they do have to appeal. I think practically they have to appeal as well, because one of the primary findings of fact is that when it came to the freezing of bank accounts, that constituted an improper seizure, and so you could potentially have, you know, tens of dozens of people who come, well, not tens of dozens, but dozens of people who come and try to sue the government over that very measure, because the judge in this case found that the government had overreached.
David Lametti, who I should point out was the Justice Minister at the time and actually resigned, will be resigning as of January 31st. He announced that today. He is also a constitutional lawyer, and he thought that the ruling was very flawed. Obviously, he has a political perspective now beyond just being a lawyer. But Chantal.
I think the public interest is well served by the appeals. We do need a definitive legal read on this. I'm not convinced that lowering the threshold for using what is a very powerful law is necessarily the way to go, or a reason for any of the parties that are not the Liberal government and the House of Commons to say, yeah, let's make it easier to use this law. It should be hard to use.
Sure, yeah.
That's the bottom line. And I'm not sure that the Liberals want to get into that fight or that they will find allies for this. No. But I am, I think it's healthy that this debate will be taking place. I'm not disturbed at all by the contradictions. Both Justice Trudeau and Justice Mosley did want to get the CSIS Act out of the, or did suggest it should be taken out. I'm also curious as to see whether there's a political price for the Liberals to pay on for this, because I've been looking back at the War Measures Act and the way it was used in the 70s. This all starts there. And I don't see that Pierre Trudeau paid a price for using it, including the abuse that came with it, neither in the rest of Canada nor in Quebec.
Andrew, last minute to you here.
And let's remember that the Emergencies Act is a much more moderate measure than the War Measures Act, and the measures that were invoked here were much more moderate than anything was done under the War Measures Act. Nobody was, rounded up without trial, et cetera. I think, just on the point that Althia made about, I think that the part of it that's going to most likely to withstand appeal is the business about the freezing of the bank accounts, not because it was some flaming injustice in itself, but the thing that the judge emphasized, and I think rightly so, was the police were basically making it up as they went along. They didn't have any clear set of guidelines or rules, again, because this was the first time it had ever been invoked, doesn't excuse it, but the definitions as to who exactly this would apply and on what grounds was not clear, and they were sort of feeling their way. They made judgment calls. That's not sufficient with something like that. You need more clear guidelines, and if that comes out of this, that will be all to the good.
Okay, we're going to take a short break here. Althia, you can start us off on the next round, where we are going to talk about the Liberal caucus that started today and runs in tomorrow, and at least one Liberal MP who went from suggesting the Prime Minister should go to say, nah, I maybe misspoke. Can Justin Trudeau rally his troops? That's next on The National. A Liberal MP suggesting it might be time for Justin Trudeau to go is not the ideal way to start a caucus meeting.
If people are still intent on having the leader we have now, fine. but at least give people the opportunity to have their say.
Ken MacDonald quickly changed his tune, saying he supports the Prime Minister and he's a great campaigner. But poll numbers remain dismal, forcing the PM to try to rally the troops at caucus today.
We've gotten a lot of big things done over these past years, and we're eager to do even more.
So should Trudeau be concerned about the comments from one MP, and can he keep caucus on side? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Andrew, and Althia. Althia, as promised, I'll start with you. Obviously, this is one MP who said some things, then said, oh, maybe I didn't mean those things. We do know that there are other people talking quietly, but is this a noticeable crack or problem for the Prime Minister?
Well, I don't get the sense that it's as acute as it was in late August when we spoke about this, when actually I spoke to Ken MacDonald. It's easy to have those thoughts when you're in your riding and that's all you've heard for the past 7 weeks from constituents who really dislike the Prime Minister. It would have been more honest for him to say, well, I realize that I put my colleagues in a bit of a pickle and I'm really sorry. And I probably shouldn't have done that, as opposed to saying, I suddenly decided that actually we do not need a leadership review. But, you know, I am one who believes that we want MPs to speak frankly. And so I'm not willing to be that critical of MPs who do, even though I know it puts their colleagues in a bad place. Can I please squeeze in on the Emergencies Act that one of the things that was really key in this judgment is the judge said it was too broad, but it was too broad because Ontario did not do its job. And so I feel like that cannot be excluded from the conversation.
Okay, no, you're hijacking this part of the panel. I've got to go to Chantal now. I've got to go to Chantal. Chantal, on the issue of caucus, because I think the last time we talked about it, you did say he's got about 2 or 3 months here, and then time's kind of up, where he has to decide if he's staying or he's going. It seems that he's staying, and it doesn't really matter what people like Ken MacDonald are saying.
Well, he's got two advantages to his side. The first one is the one you mentioned, and at this time, it is getting very late in the game, especially if you have a leader who doesn't want to go. And we did not see, we saw the contrary, the opposite of a mass movement being led by Ken MacDonald.
Yes.
But I understand that when you are sitting in your riding and you're hearing all this, Trudeau is not the person I hoped, etc., that you could come to that conclusion. But if you are doing the extra step, you're not finding the person who will save you. Coming to your brain and having you do, I'm going to make sure that we get this other person. And I think that saves Justin Trudeau. There is no evidence that any of the names that we've heard as possible successors would do better and not worse than he has or would be doing.
Yeah, and there's no one really, well, there's certainly no one trying to oust him in an active way that I know of anyway, Andrew.
And no way to do it. Look, there's nothing wrong with an MP speaking his mind. I'm sure he's speaking for a lot of people in the party, and it's certainly an arguable proposition. You can argue that one back and forth as to whether the Prime Minister would be better to leave or to go. You know, there's no doubt he is now a liability for the party more than an asset. But as Chantal and Althia said, you know, it's not like there's a lineup of contenders waiting to take his place who would do any better. But the real question is, supposing you did want to get rid of him, there's really no mechanism to do it. Partly because he owns the party, partly because he saved it when it was nearly on its last legs, and because of the process by which he was elected, which he didn't even have to be a member, he just had to be sort of driving by the precinct when the vote was on. And you could, you know, sign up to vote for the leader. So, and the whole premise of that leadership campaign was, let's get rid of the barons. Let's get rid of any of these divisions and hierarchies within the Liberal Party. Well, that's great. When you do that, however, you leave nobody who can call him to account, nobody who can challenge him. It's just basically the Justin Trudeau party. So when you are stuck like this with a leader who's desperately unpopular, you got nowhere to go.
Well, surely caucus could rise up, though, if they were all like
they all moved together.
Yeah, if someone other than Ken spoke up, surely something would happen. Chantal and then Althia.
Well, someone other than Ken did not speak up, obviously.
No, that's right.
Since Ken is not speaking anymore. But also,
I doubt he can speak anymore.
No, that's right.
But a caucus only rises up when it has someone to rise behind.
Yeah, that's right.
Like Paul Martin, etc. There is no one like that.
No.
That's not happening. So I understand the need to find a way to do better. That's what parties do. They try to control what they can. In this case, it's leadership. I don't believe that they can go anywhere with this, even if they had a process.
Althia.
I don't think the lack of process is the problem. To your point and to Chantal's point, the MPs could, if they really wanted to make Justin Trudeau's life miserable, make it miserable. I don't necessarily think that it's that they don't have another Messiah waiting in the wings. I actually think most of them do believe that Justin Trudeau is their best shot at least retaining as many seats as they possibly can in the next election. That is still the feeling within caucus, and until that changes, you will not hear them rise up.
And that may well be true, you know, a la Brian Mulroney in '93. He probably would have lost badly, but he wouldn't have got reduced to 2 seats.
So
we hear that argument too from them.
Yes, we do hear that
And
argument.
you have to make that argument. It's not a great time.
The Liberals and the Conservatives went for the savior notion when they went for John Turner in '84 and for Kim Campbell. And in both cases, that didn't pan out, even if the polls were great after the leadership vote.
Sure, but are we at the point now where the polls have been so consistently bad that there's no hope of turning things around, or if the economy turns around and inflation is there still some sort of window here for him, or should people just give up that notion altogether? Chantal,
If you had been writing and having to make a call on the eve of the 2011 election, would you have written that Jack Layton was going to win Quebec? No, because your bosses would have taken you off the air for saying things that made no sense. Same with my bosses.
Yeah. A year before the 2006 election, there was a flourishing dump Harper movement within the Conservatives. A year before the '93 election, there was a flourishing dump Chrétien movement within the Liberals. A lot can change within a year, let alone 18 months. So there's still many innings to play here.
last word to you, Althia.
Well, I could just add another example. In the lead up to 2015 election, Thomas Mulcair was leading in the polls. So who knows? Anything can happen. It's still a really long time until the next campaign.
We're going to take a short break here, but when we return, we'll discuss how Canada is preparing for the U.S. election and their approach to U.S. Canada relations going forward. That's coming up. The federal government says a Team Canada approach is needed in response to America's upcoming election and a potential Donald Trump win.
There are a lot of things at stake in the Canada-U.S. relationship that are vital and that we want to make sure that we handle as best we can to put Canada in the best position possible.
So what's to be made of the Liberals' approach to Canada-U.S. relations preparing for the outcome of this election? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Andrew, and Althia. Andrew, you start us off here. Not the first time we've seen the government do this, but they are doing it really without knowing how this is going to shake down in November.
Yeah, and it's great to be prepared, but what are you exactly preparing for? If Trump gets in to another presidency, it will be entirely unlike even the craziness of the first Trump presidency. Yeah. And frankly, tariffs are going to be the least of our concerns. He is avowedly running on a platform of elect me and I will break the law. Elect me and I will get myself out from all of my current legal troubles and use the institutions of state to go after my enemies. Elect me, and he's saying I need absolute presidential immunity. The chaos and potential for violence and conflict in the United States that will follow this is going to consume the United States and is going to have huge repercussions for every other country, particularly us being their next door neighbors. So I'm all for planning for trade deals and trade negotiations and working with civil society, et cetera, but I hope there's people planning for much worse cases than that in terms of what we'll be faced with if Trump gets back in.
Like threats against democracy, Althea, the country, our neighboring country falling apart, like all those things are, I don't know how you prepare for any of that. You can prepare for policy, as Andrew points out, but I don't know how you prepare for the rest.
Well, I mean, the fact is, in 2016, they didn't actually prepare for Donald Trump winning, and so they were caught flat-footed, and so it's not a bad thing. And Ambassador Hellman, I thought, made a really good point about talking about working very locally in engaging multiple partners, and that is obviously something the government needs to do, and working, almost a year ahead of time is not a bad idea to make connections and build trust relationships that you may not have. Right. So that's not a bad thing. But the other part of the equation is what happens here. Like, so much of our national security is tied to the Americans. What do we need to do on a defense front? Like, there needs to be work on the other side of the equation that I haven't heard is happening yet, and I don't know if it will, but I think they do need to do that work too and condition the electorate that what would a Trump win mean here, and what do we need to do to protect against it?
The preparation, I guess, was, you're right, not about him winning, but it was around NAFTA and how they approach NAFTA. That's kind of the same approach they're taking again, heading into the election, Chantal.
Yes, and they're probably doing other stuff that they're not talking about, but what is interesting is that they are talking about this so publicly when back in 2015-16, even they did believe, as did many pundits, that Trump wouldn't win, but they wouldn't have been caught dead saying they didn't want Trump they wanted Trump to lose. That they're doing it so publicly is for domestic purposes, frankly. And it is to bring this notion of another Trump presidency and all the risks attendant to it. And I agree with Andrew, those risks have nothing to do with anything we saw in the first version of this Trump presidency for political purposes, because we don't know, and the Liberals believe that the dynamics or the way people see their choices in the next federal election will be impacted by the outcome in the United States. That's possible. No one really knows how, but it is also an argument to believe that there will not be an election in 2024 because the Liberals really want to see the presidential election play out before they go back to the polls.
I'll just end with you, Andrew, on this. It's true, the Liberals are talking way more about Donald Trump and the fears around that. And if he were to become president, I wonder how that works then. You know, because he is someone that pays attention to what people are saying about him, and they're sort of setting up a dynamic where it may not, it'll work even, you know, more badly than before.
I don't see how you get around that. At this point, you're not dealing with anything remotely like a normal presidency. You're dealing with essentially a lawless president who's attempting to impose a dictatorship. I don't think you can pretend everything is nice. Look, the Liberals want to talk about this for a lot of reasons, one of which is they'd like to tie Pierre Poilievre to Trump and MAGA, and you can argue that one back and forth, the validity of that. The really valid part about it is whoever is the prime minister is that's going to be their number one file, and it is absolutely valid that we have a debate and test our leaders, potential putative leaders, as to who can best handle that situation. That is absolutely valid.
Okay, we'll talk about this 70,000 more times before November. Thank you all. Good to see you. See you next week.